Today's video is all things epoxy, so we're going to cover the acrylic pour from last week. If you missed that video, then go back and watch that to see how we got the black, the gold, the bands, all the things. But today we're going to work with epoxy, and I'm going to share with you my mistakes on this one and the process itself. Review for you guys the Resiners epoxy resin. It's a 1-to-1 ratio, and I'm going to pour it on this table. I'm going to show you guys what 1-to-1. So I've done quite a few epoxy projects in my time, and I use these same cups. I love these little cups, so I'm gonna pour, and this is not by weight because sometimes epoxies, resins, and hardeners are all like different weights, and so I do it just by volume. So I eyeball the cups. Yep, this one's thicker, and so as I'm going down, I'm just gonna eyeball this cup and make sure it is literally the same volume. And it goes out thicker, so make sure that when you're pouring, you are doing it slow enough. So then I can eyeball and see that they're the same. So I'm gonna keep this on this side. So I've got A and I've got B. I'm gonna keep these separated. I'm gonna keep these separated, and I'm gonna use my mixing cup right in the middle. So I'm gonna pour it in here, and I'm gonna mix it for, the directions say, at least 3 minutes. So I'm going to make sure that the same amount is left over in these cups as each other. So I want, like, even though this is thinner and it's pouring out faster, I want to make sure that I'm leaving the same amount of product in here as is in this cup. Some wooden stir sticks, and I'm going to start stirring. I'm gonna do this for at least 3 minutes, but I'm gonna do it probably for 5. As you swirl it, you don't wanna pick up the stir spoon out of here and then put it back down, because that's gonna put more air in it. You are gonna get some air bubbles in here, but it's not that big of a deal, and I'll show you how to get them out with the butane torch. It is going to look like you're gonna see a swirl. It's not gonna get clear until it just like sits for a bit. So I have a timer on my phone right now. I set it for 4 minutes because I had been about a minute after they had started mixing together. It is a science, so you really have to follow the instructions well. Now while this one's being stirred, I'm gonna go ahead and start my next one. So I'm gonna put B over here by B, and then A is gonna be right here. This is like patting your belly and patting your head and rubbing your belly at the same time, right? And then that one needs a little more. Now I have a little trick that's worked with me on other epoxies. It's where I use a secondary pour, a secondary cup that the first mix goes into. So this is going to be my first mixing cup, this is going to be my second mixing cup. And it makes sure when I pour these in, some of them touch the sides and sit on the sides and the bottom. Now that they're all mixed up, I want to pour this cup into there, let it sit for an additional 3 to 5 minutes, possibly stir it, or just let it sit, let the bubbles come to the surface before I pour it on my surface. All right, now I am pouring. I just set the second timer. I'm pouring first batch into here. Now I can scrape the cup now, but from, oh shoot, but from my sour cream cup, I'm not gonna scrape that cup. But you can scrape the first cup, okay. Now I gotta wipe up the table. At least it was already mixed. And now, this is the second cup. I'm gonna stir it just a little bit, and then I'm gonna start stirring the first cup again. I'm gonna mix batch number 2. All right, so I just poured batch number 2. Batch number 1 is sitting right over here. And you can see how much clearer that cup is than this cup that just got poured. Do you see how cloudy it is? That's just the initial reaction, and then it goes to clear. All right, it's time to pour. So I'm gonna do this right in the center of the table so that I can just move the table around. And I can make sure it's not gonna get too thick. And again, my goal is not to scrape this cup, I'm just gonna let it drain. It's gonna be so pretty. So I'm just gonna let it sit and just kind of run while I am stirring over here the rest of the resin. As soon as my timer is done on this cup, then I'm gonna pour it in here. I'm gonna mix the rest of this because I just have a little bit left. And then I'm gonna make sure. All right, this one's been 5 minutes. Pouring it into this cup. Bring it out to this side so you can see. After it's kind of settled for a little bit, I'm just going to start dragging it around so that I can start getting it to the edges without having it pour everywhere. And again, this first layer is not supposed to be completely level. It's going to have up and down spots all over because the surface itself wasn't level. First layer of resin you really don't want to be thick unless you're using thick resin, which will say on it thick set. So we just want a thin coating layer on this first. This is how gorgeous resin is. Just makes everything pop. This is the outcome of the resin from yesterday. It is absolutely gorgeous. It leveled. I've got the light in it just so you could see how smooth it is. But oh my goodness, it's gorgeous. Highly recommend. Resin was really easy to work with. For the rest of this video, I'm going to explain to you where I went wrong and what I did right and what you can learn from this. So first, after your first coating, you're going to take a 180 grit sandpaper, you're going to go through and you're going to sand your entire surface when you're adding another layer. I could have left it, but there were some really low spots on the sides because I ran out of epoxy. And so I go through with denatured alcohol and I wipe the surface completely clean of all the dust and make sure it's fully wiped off, and then I'm going to do a second layer. Well, I also ran out of plastic cups. All I had was bowls, and I think that's where I went wrong. You are not supposed to batch mix this, and I think the bowls that I used were too big. At least that's my running theory. So I would go I would go to the store and I would use smaller plastic cups because this was too much, I believe, to mix at one time to make sure that it was mixed properly. Now, I gave it extra time. I mixed it extra long. I made sure that it sat in the container for a few minutes. I did level this table, which was good because I noticed on my first one it wasn't level and it started gathering over time over on one end. I also think I didn't drag it well enough to make it less thick. So I didn't thin it out and pull it far enough. And so in some spots it was thicker than the others and it didn't dry perfectly smooth like that first layer did. I'm having surgery in a week and a half, so there was no ordering more epoxy. It went to the client as is. I did give her a $100 discount. She said she loved it and couldn't really see all the flaws that I could, but I'm a perfectionist and I just knew that it wasn't as glossy smooth as I wanted it to be. It just had a little bit of clouding in the dried layer and just a little bit of variation, almost swirl marks within the epoxy, and I could tell in the light. And so for that I gave her a discount, but the rest of the pour went much better than any of my previous pours, besides how it finished. I used my butane torch on this layer to make sure that all the bubbles got pulled to the surface and popped so that there would be no bubbles. And when it did dry, there was no bubbles in this. The sheen was gorgeous. The gold popped out. It almost looked 3D in some areas. And so the client's super happy. It's really cute in her home with her gorgeous white chairs. And so I'm going to keep learning. I'm going to keep getting better at epoxy, but I just wanted to show you guys my process and teach you the little tips and tricks I learned along the way. I would not use Kisserel epoxy. I think that's the other thing. Brand matters. I would only use Total Boat and the first one I started with, which was that Resiners. I think the Kisserel epoxy that I mixed with Total Boat is the culprit for behind why it messed up, because I used it on the desk at first, if you remember the nightmare desk, and it did the same thing, even though I let it sit, even though I timed it properly. And so I do think brand matters. Hope you guys enjoyed this, and I will see you next week with another video.